Sure. I mean, obviously we're dealing with areas that are not under government control, areas which during the Soviet wars was serving as a basis for the Mujahideen, now today are serving as a launching pad for the Taliban forces and related sort of Al-Qaeda elements. So in this sense, we're talking about a porous border, very rough terrain, certain parts being impenetrable and very difficult to operate in. So in this sense, these are areas that are easily, one can hide out in, do training, and from there, through these porous border areas, infiltrate into Afghanistan. And not only into the parts that border Afghanistan, but straight into areas of Kabul and operate throughout the country. These are areas where the Pakistani army has not been able to take control. In fact, they've lost many major battles against many of these tribal Taliban-related militias. And in addition, when you have a Pakistani army that's not trained to fight a war, a guerrilla war in such rough terrain, but basically trained to fight a conventional war against a country such as India, it makes the task a lot more difficult. Obviously, in the case of Pakistan, you have a nuclear-armed country, probably and arguably, in my opinion, the most dangerous country in the world, because a nuclear-armed country such as Pakistan, an unstable government, it's not only dangerous for the Indian subcontinent, but for international stability. And in this case, you have the U.S. Trying its best to maintain relations with the weak government, and the knowledge that any current government can easily be replaced from one day to another. So the political instability is something that U.S. foreign policy makers have to deal with. And in addition, when you have an Afghan government, very weak Afghan government that doesn't control many parts of its own country, you have two governments that are weak, don't have full control of their own countries. One is that it's nuclear armed, and the other one is a major source of instability. This is just a recipe for major international difficulties. Like I said, beyond the Indian subcontinent, we're talking about impacting the rest of Central Asia, the Middle East itself, and when you look at, especially with the nuclear issue being one of the most dangerous in terms of individuals who might take control of those nuclear weapons. One of the greatest challenges for U.S. foreign policy, particularly with the argument of exporting democracy to other countries, is when you have certain security interests that might not always be compatible with that democracy exporting goal that one has in its foreign policy. And it's striking that balance is one of the most difficult things. It's not only in Pakistan, but we're also looking at Afghanistan and other countries throughout the world, many of them being post-conflict countries and countries that are very fragile states. So in the case of Pakistan, you would see the U.S. government for a long time backing Musharraf because it was, from a security perspective, was a reliable ally. But at the same time, many people in Pakistan who wanted democracy were saying is, how could you promote democracy when you're promoting such a figure, a military figure? So for U.S. foreign policy makers, this issue, striking a balance between security issues and democratizations, remains one of the greatest challenges, not only just for the next administration, but I would say well into the 21st century. Basically, one of the key reasons why many areas, not only in Pakistan, but particularly in Afghanistan, is that the situation is so unstable, is that local people have not been given, or what was promised to them after the fall of the Taliban has not been delivered. And much of that obviously is because in order to conduct development effectively, you need stability. And many areas where there's that lack of stability, local populations begin to trust more of these unsavory Taliban forces because they can deliver something to them. Many times is that they'll maybe force them, or some of the farmers will willingly grow drugs, and as a result they'll get money from the Taliban. There's a key nexus between development, diplomacy, and defense. All three, you cannot have one without the other. And this is, like I said, for Afghanistan, the tribal areas of Pakistan, and other areas of the developing world. You need a strong element of security, and you need a strong element of development, and also with diplomacy, because the major powers, in order to operate in many of these developing countries, these conflict-ridden societies, many times are going to have to need the diplomatic skills and the diplomatic knowledge and understanding of what the local situation is all about. Much of this anti-Americanism is not something just of something that's very recent. It's something you can also say that it's historical. In order to change those attitudes, one, it's important not to expect any immediate change. But the only way something like this can change is slowly and gradually over time. That's where diplomacy is key. Understanding local forces, understanding local politics remains a challenge for American foreign policymakers. Often they see the situation purely from a security equation, and not from what the locals want, what their needs are, what the desires, and particularly what may be their grievances. So I would say is a better understanding and insight what the local issues are, and B is, once you understand that, using effective diplomacy to address those issues. And until now, we've seen a use of a lot of hard policy, strong military tactics, but less soft policy, in the sense that it's usually the smart diplomacy needs to be combined with the harder tactics. In other words, the harder tactics can yield the short-term dividends that are needed in order to achieve certain goals, but you also need the soft tactics to yield the long-term dividends, and in this case we're talking in terms of a generational challenge. There's a fundamental need for greater effective participation from U.S. allies, specifically the European NATO allies. What we've seen is that for a long time, many of them have contributed the troops and contributed important resources and have made important changes and differences in many parts of Afghanistan. But where the real challenge is, particularly in the South, we see an effort that's lacking. And one of the greatest challenges for many of these European governments is popular opinion within their own countries. Many of the parliaments in these countries like Germany, Spain, Italy, France, are struggling to renew their mandate from year to year, because in many of these European countries, there's a lack of leadership that can effectively explain what's at stake in Afghanistan. And not only that, is the fact that in many of these countries, many of the individuals have a tendency to make Iraq compatible with Afghanistan. They fail to distinguish between the two. So we're looking at a lack of effective leadership in being able to explain what's at stake, and B is an inability to distinguish between Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, it's obviously much of it depends upon how much resources are invested. If the status quo remains, the situation in Afghanistan will become what was achieved in recent years can easily become reversible, in the sense that we could see greater instability in the country and a greater deterioration in the security situation. So basically, in the next 5 years, if the countries of NATO and the international community don't dedicate the necessary resources, the situation in Afghanistan will deteriorate, and at some stage it can become irreversible, whereby it becomes a vicious downward cycle that no one can control from the outside. There's still a chance of success in Afghanistan, but if the status quo continues, in the not too distant future, there is the strong chance and the strong potential that the situation will become irreversible.